I can tell you far more about the visual culture of the British Sunday School than you can ever want to know. But today I have narrowed that down to the work of women artists. And they're women artists whose work falls into genres of representation that are often trivialized. They may have made lots of money for the companies and organizations that they worked for, but they were great artists in their own way. So I will start with G.K. Chesterton, who advised children to read all the pedants' screeds and strictures, but don't believe in anything that can't be told in coloured pictures. It was a playful but pertinent jest, accidentally reflecting a convergence of technological and educational innovations which directly impacted on the culture and concept of childhood. New developments in the printing industry at the end of the 19th century made possible the mass production of colour illustrations at relatively little cost. Thank you. Is it that?
Yes, it should be.
Right, thank you. Okay. At the same time, the new psychology of child study was just taking hold in Britain and America and being actively promoted by influential members of the International Sunday School movement. Addressing the different psychological needs of the various age groups within the newly established graded Sunday school curriculum was not only a matter for teachers, but also the publishers who supplied the printed materials for use in the classroom. This paper offers a brief overview of the contributions to the transatlantic exchange of pedagogy and pictures in the first half of the 20th century. An unnamed UK Sunday school teacher described how she once asked her class to identify their favourite Bible picture from those put before them. She was shocked then when one boy selected the Massacre of the Innocents. When asked to explain why he had chosen it, he replied, "It's got soldiers in it." I think we can safely assume that the child did not harbour any homicidal tendencies. Rather, his choice was linked to his personal experience, which no doubt included the pleasures of childhood games fueled by adventure stories and involving play fighting with wooden swords, and where death was a temporary rest on the ground before returning to the fray. This linking at a simple level is an instance of what the art historian H. Gombrich termed the beholder's share, also associated later with reception theory. The beholder's share is an acknowledgement that the work of art, text, music, painting, is always incomplete until it is read, and that in that reading the viewer's apperception comes into play, which is to say their engagement with a painting is not restricted to the visual artifact before them. Rather, it is also informed by that individual's memory, experience, and imagination. In other words, the response is psychological. George Hamilton Archibald, a Canadian trained at Hartford Seminary, Connecticut, before arriving in England, did understand children, and with the financial support of George Cadbury, made it his life's work to share his knowledge with Sunday school teachers. His lecture tours throughout the United Kingdom helped change attitudes to teaching and shape a new graded curriculum that placed the child at the centre of lessons. P.B. Cliff credits him with being the architect of the Sunday school in the 20th century. Clyde Binfield goes further, arguing that if Sunday school were an art form, then George Hamilton Archibald was its Diaghilev. But Archibald was under no illusions as to the difficulties he would encounter writing that. The battle for children's rights is a long one. Adultism relaxes its grip with reluctance. The old slave-owning instincts persist, and the slow change over to the child's point of view is made by slow degrees. Elsie Anna Wood attended one of Archibald's courses, and his championing of seeing things from a child's perspective, both literarily and metaphorically, left a lasting impression on how she approached her work. Stuart Fuller, a close friend to the end of her days, was in her Sunday school class and remembers that she was happiest when sitting on the floor with the youngest children. And we moved on from that first page, but that opening page had two illustrations by Elsie Anna Wood. One was the hilltop at Nazareth, and the other was a background picture that I'll explain the use of later. Oh, and at the bottom of your handout, there's a two-page handout with a list of Elsie Anna Wood's pictures for the SPC, the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge. There is a link, it's not a hyperlink, but there's a link to a very, very good paper about how Archibald and George Cadbury brought into being West Hill College and brought forward this child-centred approach to teaching. By the 1930s in the UK, pictures had become an established component of Sunday school lesson plans, no longer limited to wall decoration or illustrated attendance stamps. This burgeoning emphasis on the visual in religious education was embraced by the SPCK, the RTS, Religious Tract Society, and commercial publishers such as the Shaw Picture Company. With such an embarrassment of riches available, as shown in the photograph of the NSSU's, that's the National Sunday School Union, Picture and Lantern Department, it was not long before the need for discernment was expressed and often underpinned by the adultism that Archibald decried, as when M.I. Jacks, headmaster of Mill Hill School, wrote that children at some stage or other have an appalling taste for sentimentality. I confess I was one of those children. A surprising inclusion in the NSSU's offering of pictures is Margaret Tarrant's All Things Bright and Beautiful, and I've put, as skillfully as I could, red lines around this. No doubt Jacks would have deemed this and Tarrant's numerous other religious paintings for the Medici Society sentimental, as they are often replete with exuberantly winged angels, populated variously by German shepherd dogs, birds and mammals of all description. Seen from the viewpoint of a child who had the picture hanging on their bedroom wall, these visual ingredients connote the tactile pleasure of feather and fur. Why do children have soft toys when they go to bed? It's for comfort. Combined with the comforting presence of Jesus watching over them through the night. The Medici Society credited the phenomenal sales of this picture with saving the company from bankruptcy in the financial depression of the early 30s. Evidence that it was not only children who had a taste for sentimentality, appalling or otherwise. The Sunday school press also promoted giving small framed pictures to children as prizes for attendance rather than the usual books. And surviving examples invariably include All Things Bright and Beautiful with a presentation prize label on the back. As with all the artists who be discussed here, Tarrant's work was also licensed by the Providence Lithograph Company for use in US Sunday schools, but limited to her version of Jesus with the children of the world and the 14 illustrations she produced for John Oxnard's The Hidden Years. I don't know if anyone knows this stuff. John Oxnard's The Hidden Years is remarkable. It's first published in 1925, and it's one of only two books I know, apart from Michelle Roberts' The Wild Girl from the 1980s, that hints at a romantic relationship with Jesus. The story is told from the perspective of a boy who is a friend of Jesus and how they grow up. And there is also a girl who becomes a friend, who becomes attached to Jesus, but who one evening goes up to the hilltop with Jesus, coming down, understanding that the way forward is not through the usual patterns of love, of earthly love. So it's a very interesting book, and of course very pertinent that it was published after the First World War, when lots of women who might have wanted otherwise were forced or whatever to living lives without a partner they might have wished to have. Evelyn Stewart Hardy. This is an unsung heroine of the Sunday school in terms of pictures. Both of Evelyn Stewart Hardy's parents were artists, as was her brother Paul. From the correspondence files in the Providence Lithograph Company archives held by the Rhode Island Historical Society, it would seem that in the late 1920s, in addition to having painted over 1,000 pictures for the Shaw Picture Company, she had the responsibility for supporting her family. This is hinted at, she never explains it explicitly. The context is of interest, as it would be all too easy to reject her paintings as hackwork. These are used on take-home papers in the USA, licensed by Providence. Between 1925 to 1959, Providence licensed 61 of her paintings, with payments varying from $45 to $165 for each one. As she died in 1935, we can assume that the contractual arrangement was with the Shaw Picture Company. Her correspondence with Mr. Ode at Providence, mentioned above, is at odds with the commencing date for licensing her work from 1925, as in 1929, she was in very delicate negotiations with them about the possibility of her working directly on commissions. Hardy is to be commended for her staccanovite output, but it is hard to determine the quality of her paintings for Sunday schools, as they were produced to be printed by the thousands and usually on poor quality paper. In later years, advertising for her attendance stamps and wall pictures emphasised their low cost, as in the front, the advertisement on the junior course lessons. And the artist who created them was never credited, never mentioned by name, except by Providence. The contrast with the experience and paintings of Elsie Anna Wood couldn't be greater. It may be argued that Wood was merely an illustrator and not a painter, a dismissal I would refute, as can be seen for the following selection of her work. And I'm going to work through these. I won't comment on the baptism, but the woman at the well, the woman of Samaria, is an interesting picture because although Evelyn Stewart Hardy wasn't given the scope to render Jesus in terms of facial expressions, Elsie Anna Wood certainly was. And here we have a Jesus who is actively listening. You can see there is an interaction with these people instead of Jesus being presented as the dominant person in the picture. There is always a relationship. This is reflective of what Archibald was trying to engender in the Sunday school through children and the teacher, that it wasn't a directional communication. It was an interaction. It was a discussion, hence the use of storytelling, and a storytelling that didn't end at the end of the story, but one where children then were asked questions relating what they had heard to their own experiences. And this is perhaps my favorite Elsie Anna Wood picture, Martha and Mary. And again, the expression on Jesus's face is one of attention. He's listening to what Martha says, even if later he will say, but Mary understands Martha. And I think that is beautifully rendered, but I don't know if you can see it from your position, but the backgrounds are always wonderfully rendered and the colours are absolutely beautifully done. Now, Elsie Anna Wood wasn't the first artist to go to the Holy Land and bring back pictures. We could start with Tissot, who made a very, very nice living from the paintings that he put together for the Old Testament and the New Testament, licensed them himself, kept total control, became a rich man on that basis. William Hull was the next person up to visit. Then there was, of course, the famous Harold Copping, who helped fill the coffers of the Religious Tract Society with his paintings based on sketches in the Holy Land. So then we come to Elsie Anna Wood, who was sent there by the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. And again, she writes in her autobiography, which she had to self-publish, of the Stony Pass. On one occasion, she was hospitalized as she stepped aside from an oncoming car and tripped over a stone and detached a retina, which put her back some months in terms of her work. And this is a painting that was produced after she had that accident. And someone who knew her in the Holy Land at that time says, and yet nobody noticed that where Jesus is, the disciple that Jesus is washing the feet of, doesn't have any toes, because she still hadn't got her full sight back. It may be argued that Wood was merely an illustrator, I've said, but the following selection of her work, or the work that we've just looked at, which hint at what might have been ahead of her if her art training had continued to the academy schools. We'll see later on why she didn't. While working with Constance Padwick in Cairo, illustrating books published by the Nile Press in 1919, that was her first visit to the Near East, she wrote, "I found that I had embarked upon a mode of work which both printed more clearly, was more easily understood, more decorative, and was incidentally more satisfying to myself than my old way of working. Although at the time I did not realize it, this study was for me the equivalent to the language study with which most people started their missionary career. I was learning not word language, but picture language." She added that it was an apprenticeship of sorts, as she had to find a different approach to painting, which took account of the effect of intense sunlight on the landscape and the built environment. These were challenges she would face in Palestine. In the pictures we're seeing, particularly, I think the one of Martha and Mary, we have a reordering of the usual coding, visual coding of authority, which is an interesting intervention. Also, it's not only about what you see, but what you feel about what you see, to go back to the notion of bringing your experiences and memories together. So the little boy who said, well, it's got soldiers in it, well, he had a point. Oh, I didn't mention, these were some of the many pictures, 94, I think, in total, that Providence licensed for use in American Sunday schools, and more of her paintings. The sad thing is that there was a fire at the SPCK's headquarters, and although the paintings were unharmed, they were water damaged because of trying to deal with that fire. Now here we have the picture that you have on the front of the programme, the Annunciation. And the model for this was Nahiba Sabah. And I'll tell you more about her. Can I just mention, Bill, that there's a connection here to Brooks, in that Nahiba's son, Habib, is a graduate of Oxford, of the business school. The model used for her painting of the Annunciation was Nahiba, who lived in Nazareth. Her father, Nimeh, was the Arabic language professor at the British subsidised government school, and the two of them became firm friends and correspondent for many years, as I did with Nahiba. In her autobiography, Wood writes that from babyhood, she was pitched into the full running stream of the nonconformity of the 19th century, as both her parents were of Baptist families. The narrative of her life before the relative calm of being commissioned by the SPCK in 1933 to travel to the Holy Land to paint 15 pictures depicting the life of Christ seemed to have been a series of destructions caused variously by her father's redundancy. Well, he was sacked, I believe, leading to her withdrawal from Hornsey Art College. Hence, she couldn't go on to the academy schools in order to support her family. Her sister's death after giving birth, requiring her to return from her missionary training course at Kerry Hall to look after her infant niece, Joan, and the subsequent contracting of tuberculosis. But it was perhaps her early Sunday school training, fused with being the giver for her niece that made her such a wonderful observer of children, not simply as models, but in terms of their behavior, emotions, and their physicality. This understanding is manifested in her many pictures in which children, both Christ child and others, feature. Any of you who have held a child of that size in your hands will know what the weight is like. You will also know that they wriggle and that you have to hold tight to them. Elsie Anna Wood knew all this because she had to feed and change and nurse her tiny niece for the first year of her life, and she was quite a sickly infant. And then we come to the two-eyed stance with my one eye. Lionel Adey, in Class and Idle in the English hymn, has drawn attention to what he termed the two-eyed stance in many children's hymns. The child observing dear little children and the rubbing in of the smallness of children and of their weakness. This might be yet another example of the adultism identified by Archibald, but in Wood's pictures of Jesus, here, even as a baby, she paints him as a strong, confident child, looking directly out at the viewer. And I think this is incredibly powerful image, because what you see, first of all, is the Christ child. Then you see looking down, you will spot the third of the Magi. And then looking beyond them, you see in the courtyard 3 camels. Again, it's a pulling in of the child's interest, not just a looking, a seeing, but a taking them on a journey. But this required great skill. She writes, "My problem is, of course, one which does not apply in either book illustration or pictures for wall decoration in the usual way. It is that I have to get my broad values right for use at a distance, and at the same time to have the details as clear and perfect as may be, so that little children may look right into the picture. When you consider that the paintings of so many artists which require you to stand at the right distance to see the things properly, and when you come near, it is meaningless, you will see the very special care that this work requires to be right for a distance." Wood is offering children the opportunity to identify with children in her picture. And in this one, there is the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, his parents hurrying to him, but also to one side is the boy who is carrying the scrolls, who is interested in what is going on. Already it sets up a discussion for the children in the class. What is going on here? What do you think they're thinking? It makes looking an active rather than passive engagement. It is reflective of the teacher's understanding of how to elicit interest, to provide the basis for asking questions. But her representations of Jesus also encourages a perception of him as the friend of children, no longer the depressed, sometimes ill-looking man and forbidding presence depicted in pictures of some other artists supplying pictures for Sunday school. I have to confess that even though I'm on Evelyn Stewart Hardy's side on the basis of her struggles and her hard work, her pictures of Jesus do not show a healthy man. In the pictures of some other artists supplying pictures for Sunday school, he is instead, as Hugh Martin of the SCM had noted, dwelling on the physical and spiritual suffering of Jesus, tends to present him only as the man of sorrows, when he was also the man of joy. So we're going to see pictures that are about the man of joy, with whom the children wanted to talk and play. Her contract with SPCK had been laid out for her by a nephew. It was a very astute arrangement. It involved royalties as well as payment for each picture. But later she would revisit this and almost apologise to the SPCK for something that was highly beneficial to her, and they thought they could renegotiate so that she would get less. We have also the issue, the great unspoken issue of Jesus' ethnicity. And this is a man of Palestine. Let's go to this, especially so in this picture. The models, he's not even a Jewish man. Often she used Arab models. She regretted that she wasn't living in the Jewish community. And here we have a Jesus who is not the usual blonde-haired white man, which starts to address some of the concerns that have arisen recently, but were never raised back in the 1930s. She wrote in her autobiography that when she was traveling back from Palestine, a fellow passenger remarked of her paintings of Jesus that he looked strong, he looked intelligent. So this is a healthy, young, socially competent Jesus who's also from Palestine. Elsie Anna Wood was an esteemed artist in the genre of religious painting in the USA. And this is frequently evidenced in the correspondence files of the SPCK, but not always reflected in her treatment by the Society at home. In 1965, Henry C. Stacey, the Society's art editor, responded negatively to Wood's request to use some of her pictures in a proposed autobiography, this here. A great deal of interest in the project had been expressed by organisations in the USA and Canada, with even the possibility of funding hinted at. But the SPCK rejected on commercial grounds, arguing that they did not consider it an economically viable proposition. In the end, Wood arranged for The Gift of Love, which is the title of the book, to be rendered in typescript and self-published, and was allowed to use a paste-down picture on the cover after all her work for them. That's the generosity. In 1967, the Society wrote to the artist informing her that they had been visited by an American gentleman representing Whitmore Associates from Massachusetts, who listed her work in their catalogue and asked if they might have a photograph of her for inclusion in the catalogue. 3 years later, Pastor Edward Johnson of the First Church of the Nazarene, North Platte, Nebraska, wrote asking permission to use the Elsie Anna Wood slides in their weekly television program. In a memo about the request sent to the Society's General Secretary from MS Ricketts, a nominal fee of $5 per slide had been quoted. A handwritten note at the bottom of the memo begins with the stark question, is Miss Wood still alive? She was, and generously gave permission for a fee-free use of the slides. Wood's professional relationship with the SPCK continued until almost the end of her life, and over 45 years she painted 95 Bible pictures for the Society, 26 illustrating scenes from the Old Testament. I've never seen one of those. 62 from the New Testament and 7 background pictures. The background pictures were for use with flannel graph. Those of you of a certain age will remember fuzzy felt. This was an early version of fuzzy felt used in the classroom. So these would be cut out on the felt and stuck to the background pictures. That picture of the hillside that was just flowers and bees, that was what that was all about. What is remarkable about Wood's work is that she managed to be modern in her representations of Jesus without resorting to the device of extra biblical settings, as in Copping's The Hope of the World and Tom Kerr's Follow Me. Her skillful deployment of detail and perspective somehow manages to give an impression of a world that can be entered rather than just seen, a three-dimensional world. But there's the almost, as I've discussed, question of depicting Jesus as a Palestinian. But I want to go to this, and I want you to see it as a child may look at it. First of all, in the gospel, this scene is one in which Jesus chides the disciples for trying to block the mothers bringing their children to him. Here, the disciples, whether they like it or not, have had children forced into them. And so Jesus is looking at this one here. If we look at this picture, he's holding the baby, but looking down as if saying, what do I do with it? And the one behind him also looks worried, having a child on his shoulders. And then we go on to the beholder's share, what the children might see in this. Because there's what children, they look at every aspect, they move around the picture, they don't see the picture. And here, even the smallest, the little girl or boy, just behind the child with the hat, peeping through, the little girl clutching Jesus's garment, and the other children looking up, giving a sense of small, big, but not necessarily weak. I think Elsie Anna Wood was a remarkable artist. I think if she had gone on to the academy, she would have been rated in terms of her abilities. But she was a Christian, and she felt, that's why she called this a gift returned with love. She felt that she was privileged in being able to use her faith in the service of Christianity. And even though she was treated in the end badly by the SPCK, she was generously spirited. I would just add that there's one letter in the correspondence in the SPCK files at Cambridge that always irritates me, and that is when she writes to ask them if she could have a replacement for her illustrated Bible, which she has lost. They say yes, and the price would be just as copy had been milked dry by the Religious Tract Society with the contractual limitation on not being able to produce Bible paintings for any other organisation. Christian organisations by name, but not necessarily in practice.